This is Limited Run, the Complete Run Episode 8. Shadow Complex Remastered, Limited Run Game's 11th release, was the second Metroidvania-style game for the publisher. It became available alongside SideQuest Studios' Rainbow Moon on August 19, 2016. The two games couldn't have been more different in terms of tone and aesthetics. For Limited Run, Shadow Complex was a significant acquisition. The original version of the game had debuted on Xbox 360 7 years prior, and it had marked a significant turning point for digital game releases. When it launched in 2009, Shadow Complex straddled the line between indie game and major studio title. It had been developed by Chair Entertainment, a fledgling indie studio headed by Donald and Jeremy Mustard. But at the same time, it received significant backing from both Epic Games and Microsoft Game Studios, the polar opposite of plucky indies. On top of that, Shadow Complex saw its creators at the cusp of breakout success. The following year, Chair would partner with Epic and Apple to publish Infinity Blade, an iPad release that would redefine expectations for what mobile games could be, even as it set a new benchmark for mobile earnings that would only be mooted by the arrival a few years later of whale-oriented microtransaction-heavy endeavors like Candy Crush Saga and Grand Blue Fantasy. And much as Infinity Blade would carve a place for high-end visuals and classic core-oriented game design on mobile devices, Shadow Complex opened similar doors for digital indie titles. In many respects, Shadow Complex reflects the concepts that had been bubbling beneath the surface of indie gaming for years. Most notably, the game owes a tremendous debt of design to Nintendo's Super Metroid. Indie gaming had just begun to awaken to its Metroidvania moment back in 2009, as people who had grown up loving exploratory 16 and 32-bit platformers graduated to making their own games and took inspiration from their childhood favorites. A few years after Shadow Complex debuted, Metroidvania adventures would become a standard for indie developers, and it's not difficult to draw a line between Chair's work here and something like Guacamelee or Timespinner. Would we have seen dozens upon dozens of indie Metroidvanias over the past decade without the breakout success of Shadow Complex on Xbox 360? Well, maybe. But they probably wouldn't have been as good without the work Chair did to combine the structural design concepts of Super Metroid with contemporary gameplay concepts like cover-based shooting and dynamic physics. Shadow Complex brings the workings of two-dimensional 16-bit action-adventure games into the world of Unreal Engine-powered shooters. Everything in Shadow Complex is built of polygons, and players navigate the action by using the full array of buttons and sticks available on a modern dual-analog controller. In a lot of ways, the game managed to stick the landing on concepts that other developers had been exploring for years with much less success. For example, you can aim protagonist Jason's weapons through 360 degrees of motion by aiming with the right analog stick, while the shoulder triggers fire his weapons as they would in any 3D console action game of the era. This setup feels like nothing so much as the realization of the free aim mechanics Bungie and Crack.com tinkered with in their Turrican clone Abuse back in the 90s, where players moved with a keyboard and aimed with a mouse. The dual analog controller system accomplishes the same thing, but it works a lot more comfortably for a 2D side-scrolling action title. Shadow Complex stands apart from the 2D games that inspired it in other ways. Jason's main weapon, which he steadily upgrades from a pistol to a futuristic assault rifle, doesn't simply aim in 360 degrees. It also fires hit-scan projectiles, and it uses a reload system that forces players to be mindful of their clips before entering a combat scenario. Jason can crouch for cover behind boxes and barriers, and he can smash enemies with deadly melee attacks. In other words, its Epic and Microsoft parentage is on full display. Shadow Complex plays in many respects like a 2D Gears of War game. Aesthetically, Shadow Complex feels very much like a product of its time. Inspired by Orson Scott Card's Empire novels, the game takes place in a near-future America and centers on the schemes of a highly funded terrorist organization with access to sci-fi tech a little more sophisticated than real-world military gear. Think Cobra from G.I. Joe, but with white cyber armor instead of blue pajamas. The equipment you gather feels advanced without being impossibly far-fetched. The entire adventure takes place in a military base hidden beneath the wilderness. So the environments combine steel and concrete structures, advanced computer cores, and dilapidated mines and caverns. There is an undeniable Unreal Engine look about it, that distinctive combination of deluxe lighting effects, unpredictable ragdoll physics, and character faces that look a little bit like pizza dough. The overall tone of Shadow Complex fits right in with the trends of its era too. There's a lot of tough guy talk, with Jason himself presented as the brown-haired American everyman white guy, complete with Nathan Drake half-tuck, that dominated games of the Xbox 360 era. Once he stumbles upon the sprawling extremist plot taking shape in the enemy's underground complex, he goes from hapless hiker to icy-blooded mass killer in zero time. The evil plot in question feels like a mashup of the wild-eyed memes that would become commonplace on fringe conspiracy forums a decade later, revolving around a well-funded leftist paramilitary plot to overthrow the US government in order to make America, you know, great again.
Talk of the United States is the greatest country on earth. It was, and will be so again.
Okay, so the story and character models haven't necessarily aged well, but everything else about Shadow Complex holds up remarkably well in this remastered edition. The remastered tag here doesn't indicate a massive overhaul of the game on the level of Oddworld New and Tasty. For the most part, Shadow Complex Remastered is simply Shadow Complex, tweaked to run on current generation consoles, PlayStation 4 specifically in the case of the limited run physical release. Lighting and character models are more advanced here than they were in the original Xbox 360 game, and players can tackle alternate master challenges, earn revised trophies, and save their progress to the cloud. Otherwise, Shadow Complex Remastered simply carries forward the content of the original game directly onto PS4. It's an expansive, exploratory action game set in a single, interconnected environment. It wears its influences on its sleeve, even as it tries to mix up its mechanics and power-ups to distinguish itself from Super Metroid and other classic Metroidvanias. There's no questioning the germ of its inspiration, and Cher admirably recognized the fact that there's no need to tinker with greatness. While Jason's abilities have their own distinct flavor to separate his journey from Samus Aran's, the overall flow of progression is classic Metroidvania. You even use missiles to blast through red-coated obstructions in the environment, just like in the Metroid series. But it's one thing to simply mimic the classics. It's something else altogether to demonstrate an actual working understanding of the details that made those works classics in the first place. By and large, Shadow Complex gets it right. The game world here fits together in a complex, interlocking fashion, with gated progression that requires ample backtracking, yet rarely leaves you wondering where you need to go next. There's an optional waypointing system that directly indicates your path to your next objective, but even without the arrow, it's pretty easy to get a sense of destinations. The in-game map system is a more detailed take on the Super Metroid Symphony of the Night map, indicating collectibles with question marks, and destructible barriers with a color-coded markup system that corresponds to the tool or weapon required to get past that point. The equipment Jason acquires throughout his adventure cleverly mixes the standards of the genres and games that helped inspire Shadow Complex. He begins his quest as a guy in a jeans and t-shirt, hunting for his lost girlfriend and armed with nothing but a flashlight. Along the way, he acquires firearms, advanced body armor, and secondary weapons that help him navigate the world. What Shadow Complex really takes from Metroid is the fundamental concept behind that series' upgrade process. The gear Jason collects doubles as both weapons and tools. Not only do his newfound powers allow him to more effectively combat the terrorists who populate the underground complex, they also allow him to see more of the complex itself. Secondary weapons like grenades inflict major damage on foes but can also shatter obstructions. Supplemental gear like the grappling hook can disarm enemies and strip away their armor while also helping Jason to reach otherwise inaccessible areas. Foam grenades can immobilize foes, shatter machines from within, and create temporary platforms to leap on. Even the speed booster power can disintegrate enemies and barriers alike. The more powerful Jason becomes, the more of the complex he can explore. Naturally, he encounters ever deadlier enemies the deeper he descends into the enemy base. Standard enemy foot soldiers are replaced by bruisers wielding shields or guys with miniguns. Stealth soldiers who grapple out of range and drop grenades at you descend into action. You face off against ever larger armored foes including spider tanks, soldiers wearing armor like Jason's, and towering walkers with defensive shields that repel your attacks. Unless you play on hard mode, Shadow Complex's combat is rarely too challenging. You're more likely to fall afoul of environmental hazards. The glowing red radioactive zones that can cook you in a matter of seconds are especially tricky since there are plenty of perfectly harmless areas in the environment that also glow red. It's hard to know which is which until you're dying horribly. Between his free aim run and gun skills and his unique upgrade loadout, Jason ends up playing quite unlike any other Metroidvania hero before him. His unique qualities shine through even more brightly when the game breaks from convention to do something unexpected. One particularly memorable sequence sees you blasting open water valves in order to flood a vertical shaft of the complex and short out an otherwise unstoppable enemy machine. But the game follows through on the question of what it means to flood an underground structure, and before long you find yourself swimming through the devastated wreck of the enemy barracks. It's a moment of eerie tranquility amidst mass human carnage, as soft piano music accompanies your maneuvers around the waterlogged corpses of bad guys caught unaware. Shadow Complex can often be a bloodthirsty game, but at times its wanton slaughter can be downright artful. The game isn't without its hiccups. The convoluted interior of the underground base has its share of one-way points that make it impossible to backtrack through them. If you decide to go exploring, it's possible to get stuck in an effective dead end and lose half an hour simply trying to get back onto the proper track, which is a lot in a game that can be completed in 5 hours. The game also encourages you to go exploring at the very end to fill out your inventory and acquire a special upgrade that can only be unlocked by finding hidden passcodes throughout the base. However, without a fast travel or warp option, this can be a pretty drawn-out process, and ultimately you don't really need the final upgrade the passkeys unlock. At the same time, the game seems to end abruptly. Once you've hit a certain point in the story, you head over to the lake above the complex and take down a massive airship while evading attacks by every kind of enemy and boss you face throughout the game. It's an impressive set piece, but there's no real lead up to it, and once it's over, the game simply ends without ever referring back to the prologue that set the entire game's events into motion in the faraway streets of Washington, DC. The sudden credits roll leaves many questions about the game unresolved, and for a while the prospect of a sequel felt like a certainty. As time has gone by, however, that seems less and less likely. Cher's success with Infinity Blade led to studio head Donald Mustard's move to Epic to become the company's creative director, and the idea of following up on a modest indie breakout title like Shadow Complex must seem impossibly trivial compared to the scale and success Mustard manages in Fortnite. But then that simply helps to underscore what makes Shadow Complex so interesting and such a great fit for limited run games. While the gaming biz doesn't leave much room for a company of Epic's scale to dabble in minor projects like this, Shadow Complex's legacy, its reach and influence, amounted to a momentous release for limited run during its early days. By combining the tech and mechanics of modern 3D action titles like Gears of War with the intricate hunt and fight structure of Super Metroid, Cher presented other indie developers with a compelling template for exploring the Metroidvania genre in fresh new ways. We may never see a true sequel to Shadow Complex, but in a way, most indie Metroidvanias since 2009 are its spiritual sequels.